Where did that come from? Origins of some cherished Christmas traditions by Tom Kelleher. About the presentation. What would American Christmas be like without Christmas trees, mistletoe, Santa, and for that matter, Rudolph? You can just what is a wassail or Yule log anyways. This illustrated talk looks at the origins of some of the most popular American Christmas traditions, including why for a long time most New Englanders did not celebrate Christmas. About the presenter. Tom Kelleher is a historian and curator of mechanical arts at Old Sturbridge Village for over 30 years. He regularly teaches and demonstrates at museums and historical societies around the country. Tom holds a master's degree in history from the University of Connecticut and writes for many magazines and journals. Tom.
Thank you very much, Eric. And thank you all for having me out on this dreary, rainy night. We'll hope for the best. So, as Eric said, for a long time, Christmas was alien to most New Englanders. Of course, this area was colonized initially by English men and women who were Puritans. They were followers of a 16th century Franco-Swiss theologian named Jean Calvin, and for various and sundry reasons, they wanted to purify Christianity. And so, by the late 1600s, it was actually a crime to celebrate Christmas in New England. You had to pay a 5-shilling fine in the 1680s if you dared to celebrate Christmas. So it was something that was not part of their culture. We got a lot of things here from good old Governor William Bradford. What the heck? We may as well read it out loud for those who can't see the small type. On the day, this is from Governor William Bradford in his report on Plymouth Plantation. On the day called Christmas Day, the governor called them out to work as was used, as was the custom. But the most of the new company excused themselves, in other words, the non-Puritans who had shown up, and it set against their consciences to work on that day. So the governor told them he could make a matter of, if they made it a matter of conscience, he'd spare them till they were better informed, until he'd been able to inculcate them with his religious beliefs. So he led away the rest, and they went to work and left them. But when they came home at noon from their work, they found them in the street at play openly, some pitching the bar, some at stool ball, an early form of baseball, and such like sports. So he went to them, took away their implements, and told them it was against his conscience that they should play while others worked. And if the keeping of it was a matter of devotion, let them keep to their homes, but there should be no gaming or reveling in the streets, since which time nothing has been attempted that way, at least openly. So, again, no Christmas. I love this quote by H.L. Mencken, an early 20th century American journalist, that defined Puritanism as the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy. I think that's a bit of an overstatement, but nonetheless, there was a fictitious play where they put Christmas on trial in England in the 1680s, and the accusation was, "Thou art hereby indicted by the name of Christmas of the town of superstition in the county of idolatry, and that thou hast from time to time abused the people of this commonwealth, drawing and enticing them to drunkenness, gluttony, unlawful gaming, wantonness, uncleanness, lasciviousness, cursing, swearing, abuse of the creatures, some to one vice, some to another, all to idleness. What sayest thou to this indictment, guilty or not guilty?" In other words, the Puritans said to the people that long had kept Christmas, "Oh, but it's a religious holiday." Well, what does eating too much, drinking too much, not doing work, grabbing people and force them to kiss under the mistletoe, and various and sundry other dissipations have to do with celebrating the birth of the Savior of mankind? I think that's a legitimate question. Anyway, and they realized that really Christmas was not instituted of the Bible. Of course, 2 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew and Luke, give us complementary and sometimes conflicting details of Christ's nativity, but the Bible doesn't say celebrate the birth of Jesus. The only birthday mentioned in the New Testament is the birthday of King Herod, and that didn't go so well for John the Baptist, if you remember, because Salome did the dance, and "I'll give you anything, even half my kingdom. What do I want? I don't know. Mom, what do I want?" cut off the head of that guy who criticizes the marriage of the king and me. Get it again? So that didn't go well for him. But anyway, they realized that in the early years, the waning years of the ancient world, when Christianity began to become widespread, that they weren't going to convince pagan people to convert to Christianity if they made them take away all their fun festivals. So basically, they took the various and sundry winter festivals, things like Saturnalia and the birth of the sun god Mithra, and they said, well, don't celebrate those anymore. Celebrate the birth of the Son of God. It's a good pun, works in English. Of course, English hadn't been invented yet, so they didn't really say that. But nonetheless, they basically said, let's put a Christian gloss on your various celebrations, and that was a good compromise to keep everybody happy. But these people over 1,000 years later who colonized this part of the world, they realized that the origins of all these Christmas celebrations were nothing more than pagan festivals, and they didn't find that very Christian, very holy, very religious, and of course they blamed it on the Roman Catholic Church, who they saw as literally the incarnation of the work of Satan. And so they basically took these Roman festivals and said all they are is pagan holidays changed into Christian ones, and that's no less than the Reverend Increase Mather, one of the many Mathers who were Puritan ministers here in New England. So basically, pagan debauchery is what the Puritans thought of as all these Christmas celebrations, and pretty much had stamped it out in much of early New England. But of course, despite them and the Grinch, Christmas came. There's a wonderful book about the evolution of Christmas. It's written by Stephen Nissenbaum, who I think still teaches at University of Massachusetts in Amherst. If not, he's retired from there. But The Battle for Christmas. It's an excellent and very readable history. And so we have this other little English joke about Christmas, and this one guy telling Christmas, stay away. There's Christmas in the middle, keep you out of here. No, sir, I bring good cheer. Oh, Christmas welcome, do not tear. Not the greatest thing in the world, but anyway. But basically, what was going on by the 19th century, by the 1800s, was that these outdoor, rowdy, public celebrations of Christmas with too much drinking and wassailing and other things I'll talk about more later, got supplanted as Christmas became much more of a family-centered and a much more tame and less publicly debauched holiday. And it became much more a domestic scene and made it acceptable. Another way that Christmas became acceptable in the 1800s was by people like Washington Irving and others who were in favor, who were not Puritans, who were in favor of bringing Christmas more and more to America in a more sedate domestic form. Basically took a lot of things they envisioned as a nice thing to do for Christmas that weren't really done anywhere, and they dressed them up and called them, oh, it's an old English custom, oh, it's an old Scottish custom, it's an old Dutch custom, it's an old somebody's custom, and that makes things a lot more accessible when you're told, oh, that's an old custom, even if it's not. Anyway, and that's what we've kind of done at Old Sturbridge Village. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Old Sturbridge Village. We portray the early 19th century. And as I said, in the early 19th century, most people in rural New England did not keep Christmas. But try to tell that to 20th and 21st century Americans, and they have the most difficult time imaginable getting their heads around it. But it's Christmas. You can tell them gravity worked different 200 years ago. And they go, well, the Earth might have rotated differently, and but they can't understand why anybody would never keep Christmas. So we kind of have gotten to a program that we've been doing for over 20 years now called Christmas by Candlelight, where we talk about some of these traditions. Anyway, so one of the traditions that we'll talk about tonight is the old one of chestnuts roasting on an open fire. That's a familiar phrase to most of you, I'm sure. Chestnuts were once the Castanea dentata. That's the botanical name for the American chestnut tree. And there's a beautiful example of it in flower. And there's some of its nuts and its leaves. And people would go out on these nutting parties you see in the upper right, and in the fall, and get a blanket, and boys would climb up the tree, shake the branches, and they'd catch hundreds and hundreds of pounds of these nuts, good for fattening pigs, fattening children. Very nice, meaty, sweet tree nuts. 1 in 4 trees from Canada down to the Carolinas, in the eastern part of the United States at one time was a chestnut. They said a squirrel could go over 1,000 miles and never touch the ground, just jumping from chestnut tree to chestnut tree. And so it was once the most common hardwood tree in this part of the world. What happened was in 1904, somebody at the Bronx Zoo actually noticed some of the chestnut trees getting sick and dying, and they identified it as a blight, a fungus that they figure had been introduced from Asia, from Asian chestnut trees. There's basically 3 species of chestnut trees: Asian chestnuts, sometimes also called Chinese chestnuts, European chestnuts, and American chestnuts. And the European and the Asian varieties get the blight, but it doesn't kill them. But the American trees had not been exposed to the blight until the beginning of the 20th century, and it's pretty much fatal to American trees. What it does is it fissures the bark and then gets into the cambium layer under the bark and strangles the tree to death. The fungus cannot live below ground, and so the root systems of these old trees stay alive. And you go in the woods, you find plenty of chestnut sprouts, young baby chestnut trees, but once they get old enough for the bark to start to split, the fungus gets in them and kills them, except the roots, and they put up new little shoots. And sometimes you'll see trees get to fairly good size. I had a chestnut tree. I live in Warren, not too far away. I had a chestnut tree that got up to about 9 inches, 10 inches in diameter before it died. And there was one across the road from me that got a little larger than that before it died. Supposedly, there's a stand of American chestnuts somewhere in the Ozarks, somewhere like, the Appalachians, somewhere like Tennessee, that supposedly is still alive and adult and healthy, but no one talks about exactly where it is for fear somebody's going to go in there, spread the virus, and they'll get it too. But anyway, what they've been doing over the past 100 years is trying to figure out a way to get around it. What they've done now is they've hybridized the chestnut. They've crossed the American chestnuts with the Asian chestnut, which has some immunity to it. And they've got a chestnut now that's 15/16 American chestnut and 1/16 Asian chestnut. And they've selected the ones that seem to have the most resistance. So they do have a chestnut that looks like an American chestnut because it's 15/16 American chestnut, but has the immunity of its Asian great-great-grandparents. And so they've started planting these. The American Chestnut Society started planting these. We have a couple at Old Sturbridge Village. And so maybe in 50 or 100 years, there'll be, American chestnut trees big enough to bear nuts again. But for now, when you get chestnuts, it's from usually the European chestnuts, sometimes the Asians. But the European chestnuts are larger than the Asian ones. So that's usually what you get when you get chestnuts today. Like if you go to New York City, sometimes Boston this time of year, you can get roasted chestnuts on the street. But that's where the chestnut thing came from, because it was just such a common thing. The niche in the ecology that chestnut tree used to hold has largely been supplanted by oaks now, mostly red oak and some white oak, but they were around. But the whole chestnut roasting by the open fire is from a song called the Christmas Song, and it was written by the young man on the left at the piano. That's a 19-year-old Mel Torme. Some of you may remember the Velvet Fog, who died about 15, 20 years ago. He was a famous crooner. There's an older version up in the upper right. But in the summer of 1944, he was a young musician working in New York City and living in a tenement without air conditioning, and it was a brutally hot July. And he said the one way he tried to deal with the heat was to be cool by thinking cool. And so in a steaming tenement apartment in New York City, Mel Torme wrote the Christmas song, "Chestnuts roasting on an open fire," you know the one. So, and of course, 2 years later, in 1946, the legendary singer Nat King Cole had a huge hit with the Christmas song, and of course, dozens and dozens and dozens of other singers have covered it in the ensuing 70, 80 years. But that's where the whole chestnuts roasting on an open fire comes from. Now, wassail. We've all heard about wassail. You got the song. Here we come a wassailing along the leaves of green, you know. But wassail is basically a toast. It's to your health. It's like when you toast, saying to your health. And in I spent a month in Romania. When you drink there, you say sănătate, which is to your health. And a lot of people do that. So what wassail is really spiced punch. If you're poor, you base it on ale, fermented grains. If you're richer, you can spice up some wine. Add whatever you got that's special, fruit, spices. Sometimes what they would do is take bits of bread and toast it and float it in the bowl. And that's where it's called toasting, from that. You lift it up. But anyway, that's not really Christmas traditions, but it's cool little traditions. And wassailing became I'll talk more about it later, basically organized adult trick-or-treating, but at Christmas time, going around begging for treats. We'll talk more about that later. I don't want to bog down too much in anything. Gingerbread houses are, of course, popular. There's a lot of gingerbread contests this year. A lot of families get into a tradition of making gingerbread houses together every year. And that's a big thing, of course. Sometimes some are bigger than others. But it's based basically on the early 19th century. There was a revival of European folk stories. And the large impetus behind this revival of European folk stories was the Brothers Grimm, Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm. There they are, looking fairly grim. Hardly anybody smiled in pictures in the 19th century. But anyway, you think about it, these little fairy tales we tell, like Hansel and Gretel. Oh, that's a lovely story. Well, it's takes infanticide, killing children and then eating them. That's a lovely topic, and and then turning these fairly gross, disgusting, scary stories into stories for children. And the way it came is because, of course, if you remember Hansel and Gretel, they go in the woods and there's the witch's house that's made of cake and candy, and very tempting to children, and that's how the witch tempts them. I remember when I was a little kid in grammar school, every year one of the local policemen, Sergeant Sheehan was his name, would tell us about the stranger, and he'll tell you he knows your parents and he'll offer you candy. He never told us why, he just told me that. One day, after hearing this for every year for years, I asked him, why does the stranger want to give me candy? And he and the principal looked at each other like, nobody ever asked that. And he just said, he's sick. I said, what, he has a cold? Never mind. Okay, see you next year, kids. It's a different world. At least the kids hopefully are better warned now. Anyway, the point is that these the witch's house became popular in the German middle class, where families started taking that story and, as a family activity, making little gingerbread houses as a family activity. And by the middle and later 19th century, that making of what they call in German Hexelhusen, witches' houses, as out of gingerbread and candy, caught on here in the American middle class as well, as something to do as a family activity. And that's where that comes from. Of course, you could argue that in 21st century America, the central figure of Christmas is not really the baby Jesus, it's Santa Claus. And of course, he's got a lock on the holiday, and you want a symbol of the holiday that everybody's going to recognize. It's that guy, rather than a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes lying in a manger. I was asked the other day when I was in costume in Old Sturbridge Village by a little kid if Santa Claus was real, and I said St. Nicholas is very real. St. Nicholas started off in the 260s over in Anatolia. If you don't know your Middle Eastern geography, that's where the country of Turkey is today. But 2,000 years ago, that part of the world was populated by Greek speakers, and one of those Greek speakers was a man named Nicholas, who in the around 300 became the bishop of a city there in what's now central Turkey called Myra. And Nicholas of Myra was known for generosity. He is known for a lot of things. He was one of your more popular saints. He lived from about 260-something to about 340-something. So he had a fairly good long life. And Nicholas of Myra, most famous story, involved a very poor family in Myra. The man had 3 daughters, but they were so poor he couldn't afford the dowry for the girls to get married. And in the 4th century, girls who couldn't be respectably married didn't really have much prospect for a happy life. They'd probably fall into prostitution or something like that. And as a generous, good, holy bishop, Nicholas wasn't going to have that. So he snuck up to their house on a dark night. And some stories has him coming on 3 nights and throwing bags of money in the window, one for each girl. Some stories have him throwing the money in an open window, some down a chimney. And regardless, the bag bursts open. There's gold coins all over the house. When morning comes, they find enough money for all 3 girls to get married, live happily ever after. And that's where the legend of Nicholas and coming down chimneys and giving presents comes from. So that's why very often, one of the monikers we have for Santa Claus is Saint Nicholas. So he's really, a bishop. And sometimes in Germany today, nowadays in the 21st century, because of the hegemony of American media, kind of the idea of Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus, Father Christmas, a character I'll get into in a minute, kind of all merged together into the same red-suited character. But you can see the red robes of Bishop Nicholas there in these 2 slides, or in this slide. And in Europe, he doesn't have a flying reindeer and sleigh. He's got a little donkey or sometimes a big white horse that have magical powers and can fly. And in Europe, St. Nicholas shows up with the gifts on December 6th, which is the feast of St. Nicholas. So he's already come in Europe. That's how he gets it all done. He comes Christmas Eve here, does it on St. Nicholas Day in Europe, and uses different animals so they don't get too tired, and he gets all the presents delivered. The character on the right is not Santa Claus, is not St. Nicholas. That is Father Christmas from an English book from the 1830s. He looks kind of devilish. He looks like why the Puritans didn't like Christmas. He's riding a fairly nasty-looking goat. He's, though, the physical embodiment of the holiday. He's got his wassail bowl there, and he's got holly wrapped around his head, and he's got a basket of goodies, but mostly it's liquor, as you can see. So that's Father Christmas. That's not St. Nicholas. I should mention there's a little more benign incarnation of Father Christmas. I should mention why we have so many names for Santa Claus. But Santa Claus is pretty much what the character is known by in 21st century America. The Dutch have a great deal of reverence for St. Nicholas, and always have. And St. Nicholas Day is a big holiday in the Netherlands. He usually arrives in a helicopter now. He used to arrive in a steamship, which are modern incarnations of the white horse. Anyway, in the Netherlands, they get all excited about St. Nicholas coming. And here in the New World, when Europeans started colonizing this part of the planet, the Dutch colonized what's now New York City. They colonized it as New Amsterdam. And in the late 1600s, the Dutch and the English fought one of many wars, and the Dutch lost. And part of the war reparations is the British got the city of New Amsterdam, which they renamed after the king's younger brother, the Duke of York. Hence, it's New York. Well, a lot of the people that had lived there for 2-3 generations as Dutch speakers didn't decide, well, we're done. No, I was born here. My parents were born here. My grandparents were born here. We're going to stay. We'll just, pay taxes to a different government. And so in New York, the New Amsterdam turned New York, you still had little Dutch-speaking children getting all jazzed up in December about Santa Claus, about St. Nicholas coming. But in Dutch, you say St. Nick, Sinterklaas. So you can imagine all these little Dutch-speaking children running around getting all jazzed up about Sinterklaas, 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 Sinterklaas. And what do English speakers hear? Santa Claus. So Santa Claus is just a really bad muddling of St. Nicholas in Dutch, or St. Nick, really, in Dutch. Yeah, Sinterklaas. That's where Santa Claus comes from, is Sinterklaas. Sometimes you hear him called Kris Kringle. You ever hear Santa Claus called? That's even more English ears mishearing. In parts of Germany, the gift giver is not St. Nicholas. In parts of Germany, the gift giver is the Christkind. That's the angelic messenger, the baby Jesus. Well, you can imagine little German children getting all jazzed up about Kreiskind, and what do English speakers hear? Kris Kringle. It's kind of like, it's kind of like in Charlie Brown. The kids don't ever hear what adults say. It's just wah, 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 right? Yeah. So, anyway, but the idea of St. Nicholas or Santa Claus has evolved through the years. I'll talk more in Christmas stories about the poem by Clement Clarke Moore, A Visit from St. Nicholas, which of course begins with the line, "'Twas the night before Christmas." But of course, the St. Nicholas, he never gets called anything but St. Nicholas or St. Nick in the poem, because the author, Clement Clarke Moore, was a language teacher, and he knew enough not to bastardize the language and call him anything else. He wrote the poem in English. We're going to call him St. Nicholas. But anyway, he describes a right jolly old elf with a miniature sleigh and a tiny reindeer, and he was a jolly old elf. So a tiny little guy who could fit down a chimney in that poem. By the way, Clement Clarke Moore didn't come up with a flying reindeer. That was in an earlier poem called The Children's Friend, where Nicholas had flying reindeer here in America. But I've seen illustrations of him with a sleigh pulled by a turkey, wearing a raccoon skin coat. He evolves in the 19th century from the little elf dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes all tarnished with ashes and soot, as Professor Moore describes him. But he gets bigger as time goes by, as we all do, one way or another. And St. Nicholas grew by 1880. The famous New York cartoonist Thomas Nast had the happy, full-grown Santa, all with his toys here, but still with his big Dutch pipe, puffing merrily away, a little holly in his hair, little elements of the British Father Christmas. And of course, by the turn of the 20th century, you have the fur coat becoming this crimson suit trimmed in white fur. What animal has the red cloth? None. Right, so he's not dressed all in fur from his head to his foot here. He's dressed all in crushed red velvet with little white fur trim. This is because of Coca-Cola. What are the colors of Coca-Cola? They started using Santa Claus as advertising in the early 20th century, and increasingly Santa became ever bigger and ever fatter from all that sugar. Now, high fructose corn syrup, but back then real sugar. And of course, when they first started making Coca-Cola, the Coca meant it had cocaine in it. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act said you couldn't do that kind of stuff with cocaine and other narcotics anymore, so they substituted caffeine for the cocaine, and it still had a jolt, but I'm sure not quite the same. I couldn't tell you. I never had the cocaine version. I'm not old enough to remember that. So, but anyway, that's where the red-suited, white-trimmed, full-sized in every way Santa Claus comes from. And of course, famous in song and story, and beloved of children everywhere, including department stores. My adopted grandson is 3. He just got to see Santa for the other day, and Santa asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted a racetrack, and he's got like 6 racetracks. So he wants another racetrack. And Santa told him he'd get him one, and the department store Santa then gave him a little toy, and he opened up the toy. It was a tractor, and he lost his little 3-year-old mind. Santa let him down. But anyway, gift giving though, that gets into gift giving, which of course is the great American tradition. I love this one in the middle of the kids opening their electronic toys and going nuts. So of course, the gift giving starts with the 3 gifts that the wise men gave to the baby Jesus, as described in the Gospel of St. Matthew, where they bring him gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And you can see the gold and the frankincense, the incense, and the last is the myrrh. Those are prophetic. St. Matthew is full of prophecy. If we have time, I'll talk a little more about the Gospel of Matthew. But he's full of prophecy, and this is one of Matthew's prophecies. The gold signifies Jesus' kingship. Of course, the heir of King David and the kingdom of Jacob will never end, and all that. And then the incense, the frankincense, is used to worship God, signifying Jesus' divinity. And then the myrrh in the ancient world was used to embalm the dead, which is prophesying Jesus' execution and then resurrection. So even the three gifts of the wise men have prophetic meaning in the gospel. But from bringing gifts, it became much more like my grandson, the whole idea of begging for gifts and demanding gifts. And heaven knows, I don't have to tell you, that's what a lot of, especially young Americans, but even older Americans, think Christmas is all about. Charlie Brown is gimme, gimme, gimme. And a lot of people, go crazy trying to figure out how to afford it all and what to get everybody. And they don't need anything and they don't want anything, but I got to get them something. And we get into this whole thing. And then we get into the idea before I talked about wassailing, going about not just drinking spice punch, but demanding as you go to door, especially from wealthier neighbors, that you get some nice food and some alcoholic drinks as a reward for your coming to their house and maybe singing a Christmas carol with the threat, like trick-or-treating, that if you don't get the nice gifts, maybe their hayrick may be set on fire, or their cow may not wake up in the morning, or some other little threat that the someone inebriated young men and sometimes young women coming around wassailing will do. But again, domestication calms it all down. Another part of the gift giving is the day after Christmas. Boxing Day, it's called in Britain, December 26th, which is the Feast of Stephen. Saint Stephen was the first Christian martyr. He was the one in the New Testament who gets stoned to death. He's the first Christian martyr. But traditionally, Saint Stephen's Day was used for gifts to the poor, giving to the poor. You'll remember in the Christmas carol, Good King Wenceslas looked out on the Feast of Stephen when the snow lay round about deep in Christmas even, when a poor man came inside gathering winter fuel and, again, taking care of the poor. Oftentimes apprentices would put out a little tip jar, if you will. They called it a Christmas box. And sometimes with little written requests to the customers or whatever shop they worked in, that they be remembered, because apprentices are fairly young men and to consider themselves poor, and so please tip me. And we've got a lot of that in modern American Christmas, that you got to have gifts or tips for the teacher, for the mailman, for the person who shovels your driveway, mows your lawn, what have you. Everybody has their hand out for a tip at Christmas time, and so that's based on Boxing Day and the Feast of St. Stephen. And what are gifts without wrapping paper? Well, wrapping paper is really, as we know it today, is a 20th century American phenomenon. The Hall brothers, the eventual inventor of Hallmark cards, had a stationery store in Kansas City, Missouri, and in 1917 they ran out of the fancy French, they ran out of the tissue paper that then people used to wrap gifts, just tissue paper. They ran out. So the paper they had was this fancy French envelope lining paper, really fancy envelopes. You have the lining in them. I'm sure some of your Christmas cards may have little gold foil paper or something. Well, anyway, they had this fancy French paper that truthfully wasn't selling very well in Kansas City. And so they started selling people that when they ran out of the tissue paper, and people liked that even more. And so in a couple of years, they started printing their own specially designed wrapping paper, and others, like the greeting cards, have followed suit and made millions and millions of dollars selling wrapping paper. And it's another essential of Christmas that wasn't always a tradition. Now it's a tradition. But like I said, a lot of these things were never traditions. There was a time when they didn't exist, but everything has to have a beginning somehow. Christmas stockings, the stockings hung by the chimney with care in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. Again, back to Clement Clarke Moore's little poem. Well, stockings have a good tradition too. Again, St. Nicholas coming along, giving gifts, and again in Myra, dropping the gold coins through a window, through a chimney, getting them in there. But parents didn't really want to have candy or whatever for their children madly scattered around the house. That's a good way to attract rats and rodents and other critters. So they would have the kids in the Netherlands put out their wooden shoes and maybe fill the shoes with straw for or hay for Saint Nicholas's horse or donkey, and maybe some other treat for him, and then he'd take that and substitute baked goods or candy or cake or some special fruit like an orange as a reward, a return for the generosity they displayed to Saint Nicholas. Um, Now the English had less of a tradition of the sabots, the wooden shoes that were more commonly worn on the continent. And do you really want to have all this food in your nasty old shoe? No. And the British realized that you can wash stockings and you can hang them up where the rodents are less likely to get to them, and you can also fit a lot more goodies in a stocking than you can in a shoe. And so the tradition eventually evolved, especially in the English-speaking world, of the stockings hung to by the chimney where Saint Nicholas would throw down the bag of gold coins back in the original legend of Saint Nicholas. Um, and different cultures have other gift givers. You know, in the Netherlands, it's not even Saint Nicholas; it's the wise men who come with bearing the gifts. In some countries, in Italy, it's a kindly witch, La Befana. In there's other mystical characters. I mentioned the Christ kindlin in parts of Germany. Saint Lucy in the Netherlands. There's a lot of characters that show up giving gifts in various cultures. But that's where this all comes from. Puerto Rico, I think they put out shoe boxes as a kind of compromise between the shoe and the stocking. They put out shoe boxes with hay for the donkey, and then they get goodies for the kids. Anyway, Christmas cards. Maybe perhaps in this day and age with 78-cent first class postage, somewhat of a waning tradition in America. We'll see as time goes by. I don't know how many of you, more and more people just give an electronic greeting and call it a day, maybe. But I still send out Christmas cards. But I'm old, so I don't know. We'll see how long it lasts. But Christmas cards are a multi-billion-dollar industry. Billions of them are still sent out and exchanged. Sometimes it's the only contact you have with old friends as you exchange a note at Christmas time. The first Christmas card was in 1843, and it's the one there on the left. It was commissioned by a British aristocrat, Sir Henry Cole, from a graphic artist named John Calcott Horsley, so he wouldn't have to write letters to his friends. In the late 1700s, the late 18th century, there was an increasing tradition of just exchanging greeting letters at Christmas time. And boys at boarding school were forced by their teachers to write letters home to their parents, wishing them happy Christmas. And so Sir John Cole got tired of writing letters, so he commissioned this artist to make a little card for him that he could send his friends and just sign, wishing them a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year. And you can see the happy little family there drinking some wine and eating and such like that. And by the early 20th century, increasingly, you had Christmas cards. Very often they were postcards. That's what this one here on the left is I think a 1910 Christmas postcard. Postcards are increasingly popular today because postage on postcards is a lot less than first-class letters or cards. But anyway, it was popular one time when you could send a postcard for 1 cent and a letter for 2 cents. But anyway, I don't want to take all night on that. Christmas trees are another big symbol of American Christmas, and also a multi-million-dollar industry between natural trees and the artificial trees that are increasingly popular. The first notice in New England of Christmas trees was by this German author, Hermann Bochum, in 1836, The Stranger's Gift, and talking about Christmas trees. Christmas trees go back to at least the 1700s, if not earlier, in Germany, where they're a tradition. Of course, we don't have a lot of German immigrants in New England until the middle and later 19th century. But in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, the mid-Atlantic states, you had a lot of German immigrants and a fair idea of the Christmas tree. The idea of Christmas trees have fairly murky roots, pun intended. There's all sorts of legends about Martin Luther. There's legends about what I think is the Christmas tree kind of evolves from pagan winter traditions, where in the middle of winter, the evergreen tree is still alive, it's still growing, where most of the world and most of the forest seems dead. And so it was a symbol of hope in dark days. So that's my opinion of why in Central Europe, the idea of a Christmas tree taking pagan traditions and putting a Christian gloss on them comes. There are also traditions going back to the Middle Ages of trying to justify this tradition by calling them trees of paradise, decorating with apples, telling the story of Adam and Eve and the tree of paradise. Um, the Christmas tree, as we know it, is first published in New England in 1838 by a visiting English woman, a deaf abolitionist named Harriet Martineau. And she comes in 1835 and spends the holidays with a German immigrant named Karl Folanus, who Anglicanized his name when he immigrated to America as Charles Folan, and he became a Unitarian minister. He married a fairly wealthy woman and had a son with her, and he and that little son they named after him, little Charlie. And so Mrs. Martineau in 1835 saw what she called an exotic of New England, the spectacle of the German Christmas tree, at Professor Folan's house. What she described, well, let me go back. What she described was basically performance art, like a birthday cake, not a decoration that sits up for a week, or now for most people like a month and a half in their parlor. What she described was a little tabletop tree. I'm going to go ahead a couple. A little tabletop tree, like there we go, and it, of course, without electric lights, you can't keep it lit very well for long. So what she described is they'd be in one room keeping the kids busy. Some of the adults would go in another room, set up a little tabletop evergreen, put some toys, put some candy, put some cake on and around the tree, and then light some candles, and then bring the kids in. And they'd say, "Oh, look how pretty." And then they'd say, "Oh, look, candy, toys." Boom. And they descend on the tree, consume all the consumables. Mrs. Martineau describes an adult standing by with a stick and a wet swab on it to put out any fires if a kid reached over a candle or a candle tipped over because of all this candy grabbing. And then once the goodies were gone, the candles had burned out or been put out, they went in another room and had drinks and danced. And that was the end of the Christmas tree. So that was what the first Christmas trees were, and what Mrs. Martineau described seeing in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1835. She thought it was the beginning of a new tradition. That's not how Christmas trees evolved. You know, some people in England read Mrs. Martineau's book and said, "Oh, that's nice, how weird," and let it go at that. What they didn't know was that their monarchs, who were of German ancestry, were heaping Christmas trees. The House of Hanover had English kings and queens who were really ethnically German, and they would start having little Christmas trees in the palace. But the folks don't get into the palace. The people don't get into the palace. But in the 1840s, the new young teenage queen of England, Victoria, married her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Gotha, and he gave her 2 Christmas trees as a Christmas present, that first Christmas together in 1840. And at that same time, there was a revolution in printing technology called lithography, where it was much easier to reproduce drawings. And so you start to have illustrated newspapers like the Illustrated London News. And this little Christmas tree at Windsor Castle in 1848 got to be very, very popular, and it got printed separately as a little thing people could buy. And there's the young, pretty queen. There's the queen mother behind her. And there's Prince Albert with his sash as Order of the Garter and his little fancy mustache and beard. And the little princesses and princes and princesses standing around the tree in good little royal fashion. A couple years later, that same picture got Americanized. We take the sash off Albert, we take the mustache and beard off him, and we take the king off the picture, put an eagle on the tree, make the queen mother look like grandma, and make the queen look a little more middle class. And suddenly we've got it published in American magazines and becoming more and more popular. And so through this, again, domestication of this public debauched holiday of the 1500s in England, even 1700s, it becomes much more of a domestic affair. And the Christmas tree grows. And of course, like everything else in America, it's got to get bigger and bigger, like Santa Claus himself. The Christmas tree's got to get bigger. And of course, we've got to decorate the tree. If you're going to have it as decoration, not just performance art, you need more than just candy and candles to put on it. And so by the middle of the 1800s, you start having these glass ornaments that were being blown and painted in central Germany, especially in the province of Thuringia, and being sold, some as pieces of fruit, the famous Christmas pickle being one of them, but also all kind of emblems and symbols to decorate the tree in glass that's often silvered or mercuried on the inside to make it shiny and reflective. By the little later in the 1800s, Germany can't keep up. You start having people in what's now the Czech Republic, and other Central European places, and eventually even the Japanese, reproducing these ornaments, these glass ornaments that get very popular, and they just keep growing in popularity. We get into plastic ornaments, but that's more detailed than we have time for. Yule logs, that's another thing. What the heck is a Yule log? I remember as a kid, the Yule log was what they showed on where I grew up, Channel 11, all Christmas Eve. It was just a continuous film of a burning log and a fireplace for those of us who had a television, but not a fireplace, and they'd play instrumental Christmas music softly as the log burned. And every once in a while, if you kept staring at it, you could see, boop, they changed it over because they never threw in a new log. It was just, rerun the tape. Anyway, the Yule log comes from, again, pagan Europe. In the in pre-Christian Europe, of course, December is the shortest daylight of the year. I think yesterday was the earliest sunset of the year. We haven't hit the latest sunrise of the year yet, but we're getting there. So we're getting the short days this time of year. And so on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the Druids, the Celtic priests, if you will, would often get a ceremonial religious log, bless it, they'd figure out why it was so holy, and they'd light it with the idea of, on that darkest day of the year, the light and warmth of the log would encourage the waning sun to come back. And of course, after the solstice, guess what? The days started getting just a little bit longer. And so they say, hey, look, it works. And so it became a tradition in Europe thousands of years ago to have the Druids burn this Yule log, this specially blessed log, to try to encourage the waning sun. And you also had the tradition of bonfires, which are somewhat related to it. Again, it's a big fire. In the fall, of course, right before the real cold of winter, but after the frosts, you slaughter the livestock that you don't have food for over the winter, and that way you have fat and protein to keep you and your children alive over the winter. And you eat almost everything except you don't eat the bones. You might pick out the marrow, but you don't eat the bone. So you can burn the bones, and that's why we call it a bonfire. It's really a bone fire. One of those little tweaks of the language that we talked about so many times. But anyway, that idea of the cold of the forest and encourage that waning sun to come back with the Yule log. And with the revival of European folk traditions in the 19th century, the British kind of revived the idea of the old pagan Yule log into a festive holiday trapping, if you will. And again, there's the little television Yule log burning in the fireplace. The one up on the top is one I made about 20 years ago, but it's actually based on a book called The Christmas Book, published in London in 1837, when a lot of people don't have fireplaces anymore. They got coal grates. So you take a log, you drill holes in it, you stick some candles in it, and put some decoration around it, and you've got a Yule log. which, you know, is a little more festive than the little ice cream Yule log from Carvel's ice cream store there on the lower left. But anyway, poinsettias are the most popular potted plant in America today. They got introduced into the United States by this guy, Joel Roberts Poinsett of South Carolina, who was our first minister to Mexico when Mexico became a independent republic, and they had a revolution from Spain in the 1820s. And we were one of the first countries, if not the first country, to recognize the Mexican Republic. And we sent a South Carolina aristocrat, Joel Roberts Poinsett, down there as our ambassador. Now, Poinsett was also an amateur botanist, and he was fascinated by a bush that grew wild in Mexico and happened to flower in that much more subtropical environment in December. And he noticed that it had little yellow, white flowers in the middle, but these very bright red leaves. The red is not flowers, they're the actual leaves of the plant. And so he cultivated it, brought it back to America, and it became very popular. And that's why it's named after him, the poinsettia, after Joel Roberts Poinsett. Of course, Christmas fruitcake is another tradition of sorts. It's, you know, kind of a joke for a lot of people that the fruitcake that never goes away, you give it to me and I give it to her and she gives it to him, and the fruitcake just makes around for 100 years. You know, they say fruitcake lasts forever because it's soaked in rum or brandy, or just because it's, you know, nobody ever eats it. It just gets passed around. I mean, that's why Manitou Springs has the great fruitcake toss. I love this little cartoon about the fruitcake on the psychiatrist's couch and his thought bubble. I don't know, you can see the little fruitcake, the little Venn diagram on the lower right. Fruit is good, cake is great, and in between it's, yeah, nasty stuff. And the various dissection of the fruitcake there. You got the intoxicating brandy core, the luscious lime balls, the gumdrop candies, juicy cherries, and you got some stuff you're not quite sure of. And nobody, yeah. Anyway, but fruitcake had been a very rich treat. Wedding cakes in early 19th century were fruitcakes because they're rich. They got a lot of effort going into them, making all that candied citron, raisins, liquor to make them last. They're very rich and were a great treat. And in the Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, of course, Mrs. Cratchit, the crowning achievement of the Cratchit meals, when Mrs. Cratchit comes out with the flaming Christmas pudding. Well, the difference between a plum pudding and a fruitcake is how you cook it. If you bake it in an oven, it's a fruitcake. If you boil it in a pot of boiling water, it's a plum pudding. It's the same stuff. So, same stuff. It's just how you cook it. Mistletoe, another famous tradition. The mistletoe plant is actually a parasitic plant that lives off of other plants, trees mostly, and mostly in Europe. There is a variety of mistletoe that does grow in America, but the European one is what we mostly know. But it's a parasite. It grows off of the living tree, but because it's growing, it's sucking the life out of the tree, and it's green in winter. To pagan people, again, it's green in winter. It's a symbol of life. It's a symbol of fertility in otherwise dead, dormant type of year. Hence the romantic thing of kissing under it. It's life. It's virility. It's fecundity in the dead of winter. It's also a way for people to keep warm too. But that's where that comes from. The mistletoe, people in ancient Europe noticed that it seemed to grow on tree branches, and they noticed it grew where birds had landed on the tree. And when birds land, what do? They poop. Right. And so mistletoe is actually a corruption of mistletoe, which is literally dung on a stick. So that's what mistletoe is. We can use another word than dung if you want, but I'm not going to. Anyway, Christmas stories. Daddy, tell me a story, read me a story. Everybody loves stories. We got lots of Christmas stories. You know, Hallmark Channel has made tons of the same Christmas story over and over again in dozens of different movies, as others have. Of course, the original Christmas stories were the Gospels of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Mark, by the way, doesn't do any of Jesus' birth, and the Gospel of John only mentions it in a passing metaphor, namely, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Not much to build a nativity around. But the Gospel of Luke has the most extensive nativity stories of Jesus. Luke is the one who talks about the shepherds, the angel appearing to Mary, the angel appearing to Zacharias, telling him about the birth of John the Baptizer, Mary visiting John's mother, Elizabeth, when she's expecting, the baby John leaping in Elizabeth's womb when he hears Mary's voice, um, and of course the angel and the shepherds, and then when Mary and Joseph bring Jesus to the temple to consecrate him to the Lord and sacrifice some turtle doves. The prophet Simeon comes in, Simeon comes in and blesses the parents and prophesies about what's going to happen to Jesus and Mary, and then the prophetess Anna comes in and does the same, and on and on and on. So those are the stories that Luke tells. Matthew tells different stories. In Luke, Mary and Joseph are from Nazareth, and he's got to get them to Bethlehem to be born. So Luke comes up with this story of a census that takes place when Cyrenius is governor of Syria, and Joseph has to go to Bethlehem because of his great 28 generations back grandfather, David, was from Bethlehem. So he's, for some reason, the Romans think he has to go back to Bethlehem. So that gets him, in Luke's story, to Bethlehem to be born, so he can be born in Bethlehem, even though they're from Nazareth. In the Gospel of Matthew, they're from Bethlehem to begin with, and then they find out that King Herod wants to kill all the babies, so an angel tells Joseph, go hide in Egypt until Herod's dead, and then he comes back, but he's afraid to go back to Bethlehem because Herod's son's there, and so he settles in Nazareth. Hence, we get Jesus in Nazareth. So they tell complementary stories. Matthew's the only one who talks about wise men. He's the only one who mentions a star. Luke's got none of that. Same thing with the flight into Egypt and the massacre of the Holy Innocents. Only Matthew is telling that story. And of course, the other classic story we talked about before is The Visit from St. Nicholas by Clement Clark Moore. Clark Moore was a teacher of ancient languages at the General Theological Seminary in Manhattan. He never thought much of this little poem. He called it a mere trifle. It took him more than 15 years to even admit that he wrote it. He probably dashed it off in 1822 to entertain his own children. But it somehow got out. Some friend of a friend got it. It ended up being published in 1823 in the Troy, New York Sentinel newspaper, and anonymously, and it went viral, so to speak, and became very, very popular. Finally, in 1838, Professor Moore grudgingly put it in a thin volume of some light secular works he'd written. Professor Moore was a language scholar. He thought he'd be remembered for the serious books he'd published, like a compendious lexicon of the Hebrew language in 2 volumes. I'm sure you all have that. Read it around the tree, right? Of course you do. But anyway, but the little trifles were the only thing we remember Clement Clark Moore from. And the other big influencer on our minds of Christmas, one that's been remade in more movies and cartoons than anything else, is Charles Dickens' little short novel, Christmas Carol from 1843. It's the one with Ebenezer Scrooge, who's visited by first the ghost of his former partner, Jacob Marley. Ebenezer, these are the chains I forged in life. Yeah, anyway. And then the 3 ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future that scares him into not being a grunchy old bah humbug skinflint and makes him, so jovial that he, saves Tiny Tim and everything else and gives out money and becomes a changed man with the power of Christmas. And of course, more modern stories that are equally part of America. The story of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. That started off not as a song. It started off as a story. Bob May, was a copywriter at a Chicago department store. And when Santa Claus would be at the department store, they always wanted him to give out a little gift. So they'd have a little booklet, a little storybook they'd give the kids. And so they had to come up with a new one. And they didn't want to pay copyright on somebody else's story. So they'd have their copywriter, a guy who usually wrote ads, in this case Bob May, come up with a little story. Well, he wrote a little story about Rollo the reindeer, and the boss said, Rollo, that sounds awful English. Come up with some other name. Came up with Rudolph. And he said, red nose. It sounds like he's a drinker. We don't want to encourage drunkenness. No, come on, you got it. It's part of the story. So they relented on that. And he came up with a little story about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer with a terrible rhyme scheme. If you ever read the book, terrible rhyme scheme. Anyway, but it got popular. A couple years later, when he's writing the book, Bob May wasn't a very happy man. He had several kids. His wife was dying of breast cancer. It was not a happy time for Bob May. But a couple years later, his brother-in-law, a guy named Johnny Marks, took the story, made it into a song, and then I'm drawing a blank on the cowboy's name. Gene Autry, the singing cowboy. Thank you, Eric. Gene Autry made it into a very popular record, one of the most popular records ever, and it made a lot of money for Bob May. Let him put all his kids through college and have it fairly comfortable. He called Rudolph his other kid because it supported all the other kids through college and let them have a happier life, even though their mother had passed. And of course, from right here in Massachusetts, out in Springfield, Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, and How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and of course that 1960s cartoon with Boris Karloff. I must stop Christmas from coming, but how? Right? So, and of course, mine. It's not Christmas for me until I see Charlie Brown Christmas, which came out in 1965. You know, with Linus reciting a couple lines from Luke, and that's what Christmas is all about, Charlie Brown, right? And the little dancing and the little tree. We talked before about Father Christmas. Time is running short, so I'm going to, again, just say he's originally a completely different character from St. Nicholas. He's a physical embodiment of the ribald British Christmas tradition of hail fellow, well met. In Dickens, the most a Christmas present, you know, the happy guy drinking, come man, know me better, that one, you know, that comes to Scrooge, that's Father Christmas. That's true. That's Father Christmas, the embodiment of the season. I staged this. This is me as Santa Claus with a late friend of mine, Rich Gilmore, as Father Christmas, going, who the hell are you? Anyway, but yeah, again, Father Christmas is more this embodiment of the season than the whole St. Nicholas thing we talked about. Sugar plums. You know, again, well, visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. Mama on her kerchief and I on my cap. Anyway, the sugar plums are not plums with sugar on them. What they are is little seeds that have been soaked in sugar syrup and then dried. You go to an Indian restaurant sometimes, there's little caraway seeds near the front in a dish, like on the lower side there, on the lower left. That's what sugar plums are. Little seeds coated with sugar to, you know, sort of help you digest dinner. But that's what they originally were. Increasingly, it becomes any kind of confection. Marzipan in the upper left, candied ginger, candy canes. I mean, peppermint candy has been around for a long time. The idea of putting it in sticks was another way of shaping it. There's all sorts of lies on the internet about the cane shape. The reason that some Midwestern candy maker started making canes was they could hang them on Christmas trees that way. There's all sorts of lies on the internet. It's J for Jesus. No. You can believe it if you want, but it's just made up. The white for the purity and the red for his blood. No, it's peppermint candy. Anyway, Christmas carols. There's lots and lots of Christmas songs and great legends that go about them. I'm only going to talk about really one. I mentioned Rudolph in passing before. And the one I want to mention is Jingle Bells, which if you think about it, has nothing to do with Christmas. Never mentions Christmas. I don't have to tell you the words, you know, at least the first verse or two of Jingle Bells. It originally was published by James Lord Pierpont. He wasn't a nobleman. His mother's maiden name was Lord, James Lord Pierpont. He was born in Boston, died in Florida. His father was a Unitarian minister. He was a ne'er-do-well, rotten kid from the beginning. When he was 10, they started sending him to boarding school because he was too much of a handful. Kept running away from boarding school. One time, he was shooting arrows at the horses for the people that were coming to find him. Finally, when he was 14, he ran away to sea on a whaling ship. After he got back after the whaling voyage for a couple years, he joined the Navy, and that calmed him down some. But anyway, what does all this, like I said, what does all this song, Dashing Through the Snow in a One-Horse Open Sleigh, O'er the Fields We Go, Laughing All the Way, Bells on Bobtail Ring, Making Spirits Bright, what fun it is to sing a sleighing song and a sleighing song tonight. you think about it. This is nothing more than round, round, get around, I get around, or a little happier version of Springsteen's Born to Run, or other happy songs about, you know, young men and chasing young girls and having a good time in a fast vehicle. Um, but Jingle Bells has a very surprising origin. Now, if you go on the internet, I will warn you, there are all sorts of lies that are unproven, unprovable, can be proved wrong about Jingle Bells being written in Medford, Massachusetts. Pierpont's parents lived in Medford for a while. He lived with them there for a while. He abandoned his wife and children with them there for a while when he ran off to California in 1850 to the gold rush. He got back from California. His wife died. He abandoned the kids again with his parents, went down to Georgia where he'd gotten the mayor of Savannah's daughter pregnant and had to marry her. And then he stayed in Georgia. In 1857, he was writing popular music, including minstrel songs, were being published in Boston. And one of those minstrel songs was the One Horse Open Sleigh, which was first performed on September 15th, 1857. One lie you'll see on the internet, it's a Thanksgiving song. When do you celebrate Thanksgiving? Middle of September? No. It was first performed in Ordway Hall on Washington Street in Boston, doesn't stand anymore, in 1857, September 15th, by the Ordway Eloians, which means a zephyr-like wind. They, however, were a minstrel troupe. Here's a little biography of James Lord Pierpont, who was a ne'er-do-well. You can see he repeatedly ran away from school, signed aboard a whaling ship, joined the Navy, got out of the Navy, hung around with his parents in Troy, New York, met a girl, married her, had 2 kids, dumped the kids and wife in Medford, where his parents lived at that time. Went to California for a few years, failed miserably in business in California, came back, wrote a comic song, The Returned Californian, about his misadventures in 1853, and starts writing minstrel songs. Yes, minstrel, white men in blackface with terrible racist jokes doing this. His wife dies, he moved to Savannah, Georgia, dumped his kids in Massachusetts, and became an organist at his brother, who was a minister's church in Savannah. And he married the mayor's daughter and published the One Horse Open Sleigh. And his daughter arrived early, which means that, the wife was pregnant when they got married. And in 1859, the song gets republished as we know it today, not One Horse Open Sleigh, but Jingle Bells. This is the myth. You'll see a plaque in Medford if you go about how he supposedly wrote it there in 1850. He's in California in 1850. He's not in Medford. That's provable. So that's a lie. There's another story how he runs off and he's the church organist, and he gets told to write a song for Thanksgiving. And so he's got to go across town to find the one piano in town at a tavern to write the song. Well, if he's the church organist, why doesn't he write it on the organ instead of running to find this piano at some tavern? It's all made up. It's all made up. So don't believe any of that. This is proved. This is in scholarly peer-reviewed journals. This is Johnny Pell, a white man who would perform in blackface. And he was the first one who performed Jingle Bells anywhere. He performed it in Boston in 1857, as I said. It was part of what was called Sleigh Mania. In the 1850s, there were 24 sleigh-related minstrel songs with jingle, jingle, jingle in the lyrics. Yeah, it was this thing about making fun of black people, having a good time going for sleigh rides, and racist caricatures. This is from the Darktown series after the Civil War by Currier and Ives. More racist nonsense. I'm not trying to offend you. I'm just trying to show you that it wasn't always pretty times in America. Pierpont was in Georgia when the Civil War broke out. He stayed in Georgia most of the rest of his life. He joined the Confederate Army, was in the Confederate Army throughout the war, wrote at least 3 Confederate battle hymns during the war, moved around Georgia a couple times, as you can see, after the war. Eventually, ended up in Florida with his son, where he died in 1893. So, Jingle Bells is not a happy little Massachusetts song about going for sleigh rides, is all I'm trying to say. And it wasn't a Thanksgiving song, much as people would like to say it is. What is for Thanksgiving is Lydia Maria Child, who's an abolitionist, whose father and she, for a while, lived in Medford. Of course, Over the River and Through the Wood is originally a poem she wrote in the 1840s called A Boy's Thanksgiving Day, a New England Boy's Thanksgiving Day. Thanksgiving Day has nothing to do with, there we go, New England Boys song about Thanksgiving Day. Over the river and through the wood, to grandfather's house we go. Anyway, and the nativity scenes, I know I'm talking way long, I apologize. Of course, they're a big part of Christmas. They have been since the Middle Ages, when churches would set them up. Some private, rich families would have little nativity scenes set up, especially in Italy, Nascimentos, and there's a company that's still in business in Tuscany, named oh gosh, I'm drawing blanks tonight. Sorry, in the town of Lucca, that makes little Christmas figures and sells them very popularly. Anyway, sometimes people ask why some people say Merry Christmas and some people say Happy Christmas. You know, Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night. That's the line from the little Visit from St. Nicholas poem, Happy Christmas. Why do people say Merry Christmas? What other holiday do you say Merry? Do you say Merry Birthday, Merry Easter, Merry Thanksgiving? You know, Merry 4th of July, right? Everything else is happy. Happy Christmas. See, I got a little illustration that moves here. I'm so proud of myself. And again, Happy Christmas to all and whole good night. Why Merry Christmas? That's what Americans say. We can blame Dickens for that. Again, Dickens is trying to make Christmas into a family-friendly, happy holiday. And he wants merry. Now, when you make merry, you're partying, you're celebrating, you're eating, drinking, making merry. And that's what Scrooge starts saying when he's had his conversion. Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas. Not happy, Merry Christmas. That idea of dancing with his boss in the Ghost of Christmas Past, and with his nephew in the Ghost of Christmas Present, with the Cratchits after his thing. Of course, in medieval times, they're making merry. Let's celebrate. Let's eat too much, drink too much, kiss under the mistletoe, grab the lady here like the guy on the left is doing when nobody's looking, and again, these young happy people making merry. But of course, later in the 19th century, in America and in Britain, you don't want to encourage too much of this pagan celebration and drinking. You know, this is supposed to be a religious holiday. Happy Christmas. Celebrate the Lord's birth. You know, pray, go to church, be with your family. And so they start using Happy Christmas more among the more genteel set. Some people avoid the issue and just say, have a joyful Christmas, like this upper-class American family on a postcard in 1909. And again, you'll see it on the internet, Happy Christmas. And a lot of the modern Happy Christmas, especially in Great Britain, is owing to the late Queen Elizabeth II, who would always wish her subjects a very sedate and respectable Happy Christmas at the end of every one of her, 60-some-odd radio and then television addresses that she would give her subjects at Christmas time. Well, her son, of course, has split the difference. He doesn't say Merry Christmas, but he doesn't do like Mom and says Happy Christmas. He wishes his subjects a joyful holiday, a blessed holiday. Yeah, so you can go online and listen to what he said the past 2 years and what he'll say this year. We'll see. And of course, Freddie Mercury, another good Englishman, have a wonderful Christmas and a Happy New Year and a great big party. But, you know, that's Freddie Mercury. So anyway, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, we say that. So I'll just say Happy Christmas, Merry Christmas to you all, and to all a good night. Thank you for your